In 2011, Peter Thiel became a citizen of New Zealand. He had spent exactly 12 days in the country. That is fewer days than most people spend on a Netflix binge. The New Zealand government granted him citizenship anyway, bypassing its own residency requirements, because he was very rich and said some nice things about the scenery. He then bought a 4-bedroom house in Queenstown. Then he bought 477 acres of lakefront property near Wanaka, which is where they filmed Lord of the Rings. Then he submitted plans for a 10-bedroom bunker compound built into a hillside, designed by the same architect who built Japan's Olympic Stadium. The local council rejected it for being too ugly. So Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, the co-founder of Palantir, the man who bankrolled the lawsuit that destroyed Gawker, you're the first outside investor in Facebook, and the person who once said, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible," is already a citizen of New Zealand. He already owns land there, he already tried to build a bunker there, and he is worth $28 billion. New Zealand's entire annual GDP is $248 billion, which means Peter Thiel is personally worth about 11% of New Zealand's entire economic output. So what if he stopped buying property and just tried to buy the whole country? To buy a country, you first need to understand what a country actually is in financial terms. New Zealand has a population of 5.3 million people. That is fewer people than the city of Singapore. It is smaller than the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. The entire country has roughly the same population as the state of Alabama. Its GDP is $248 billion, which ranks it 52nd in the world. For comparison, Apple made $416 billion in revenue last year. New Zealand's entire economy is smaller than Apple's annual sales. New Zealand's total household wealth is approximately $2.4 trillion. That includes all residential property, investments, savings, trusts, and assets owned by every household in the country. Of that, $1.16 trillion is real estate. New Zealand's military is one of the smallest among developed nations. Its total armed forces number approximately 15,000 active and reserve personnel. Its annual defense budget is around $3.6 billion, recently increased because the government decided the world was getting too dangerous to keep pretending to be neutral. The country has no fighter jets, no submarines, no nuclear weapons. It has 2 frigates, which is fewer warships than Jeff Bezos has super yachts. In other words, New Zealand is a small, geographically isolated, militarily minimal, economically modest country that happens to be one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And Peter Thiel already has a foot in the door. So let's go shopping. Thiel is worth $28 billion. New Zealand's total household wealth is $2.4 trillion. Right away, he can afford approximately 1.2% of everything every New Zealander owns. That is not nothing, but it is not a country either. But Thiel does not need to buy every asset. He needs to buy control, and control is much cheaper than ownership. New Zealand's government runs on an annual budget of roughly 130 billion New Zealand dollars, which is about 78 billion US dollars. Thiel's $28 billion is about 36% of the national budget. He cannot buy the government, but he can outspend it in a lot of categories. For example, New Zealand's annual defense budget is $3.6 billion. Thiel could fund New Zealand's military for nearly 8 years on his personal fortune. He could walk into Wellington and say, "I will personally pay for your entire military for the next decade," and nobody would have a legal framework for how to respond to that. New Zealand's total political spending across all parties in the 2023 general election was approximately 30 million New Zealand dollars, or about 18 million US dollars. Thiel could fund 1,555 entire New Zealand general elections. The entire cost of democracy in New Zealand is a rounding error on his stock portfolio, but buying influence is not buying a country. So let's try buying the actual land. New Zealand has a total land area of 268,000 square kilometers. That is slightly smaller than Italy and slightly larger than the United Kingdom. If we use the average agricultural and rural land price of roughly 25,000 New Zealand dollars per hectare, which is about 15,000 US dollars, the total theoretical value of all land in New Zealand is approximately $4 trillion. Thiel's $28 billion could buy about 0.7% of all the land. That is roughly 1,870 square kilometers, which is about the size of Auckland or 3 times the size of Singapore. Not bad for one man, but not a country. However, there is a crucial detail here. Not all land in New Zealand is privately owned. Roughly 32% is managed by the Department of Conservation. Another significant portion is Maori customary land held under the Treaty of Waitangi, which legally cannot be sold. When you strip out government land, conservation reserves, national parks, and iwi holdings, the amount of privately tradable land shrinks dramatically. In practical terms, maybe 40 to 50% of New Zealand's land is theoretically purchasable, so Thiel's $28 billion could buy roughly 1.4 to 1.7% of the available private land, which means if he dedicated his entire fortune to nothing but buying New Zealand real estate, he could own more land than most cities, but still less than the average sheep station's annual grazing range. But Peter Thiel does not think like a real estate developer. Peter Thiel thinks like a venture capitalist, and the venture capital approach to buying a country is not to buy the land, it is to buy the infrastructure. New Zealand has roughly 30 companies listed on the NZX, its stock exchange, with a total market capitalization of about 130 billion New Zealand dollars, or approximately 78 billion US dollars. Thiel's $28 billion could theoretically acquire a controlling stake in more than a third of New Zealand's entire public stock market. He could buy a controlling interest in Auckland International Airport, which handles virtually all of the country's international arrivals. He could buy Mercury Energy, one of the country's major electricity generators. He could buy Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, the country's largest medical technology company. He could buy Main Freight, the country's major logistics firm. He could, with some creative structuring, acquire majority stakes in the companies that control New Zealand's airports, its electricity, its healthcare supply chain, and its freight network, all for less than the cost of his total net worth. You cannot buy a country's sovereignty, but you can buy the systems that sovereignty depends on. Now let's talk about what goes catastrophically wrong. Problem 1. New Zealand has an Overseas Investment Act. This is the single biggest obstacle between Thiel and his personal nation-state. The act requires foreign buyers to get approval from the Overseas Investment Office before purchasing sensitive land, significant business assets, or fishing quota. Sensitive land includes anything near the coast, near a lake, near a reserve, or over a certain size threshold, which in New Zealand is basically all land. Thiel is a New Zealand citizen, which exempts him from some of these restrictions. But the moment his acquisitions reach a scale that looks like a coordinated attempt to monopolize national infrastructure, the government will intervene. New Zealand may not have fighter jets, but it does have lawyers, and its lawyers are very good at saying no politely. Problem 2, 5.3 million people live there and they vote. New Zealand is a functioning parliamentary democracy. Even if Thiel bought every commercial asset in the country, the government could nationalize any of them with an act of parliament. New Zealand has done this before. In the 1930s and 1940s, the government nationalized banks, airlines, and the entire railway system. They know how this works. They have the receipts. The moment a single foreign billionaire starts accumulating critical infrastructure at scale, the political backlash would be immediate and overwhelming. New Zealanders are famously protective of their country. This is a nation that banned nuclear-powered ships from entering its waters in 1984 and has not backed down since. The idea that they would let one American tech billionaire quietly buy the airport, the power grid, and the freight system without a massive public revolt is fantasy. Problem 3. Palantir. Peter Thiel co-founded Palantir Technologies, which is one of the most powerful data surveillance companies on Earth. Palantir has contracts with the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the US military, and dozens of allied governments. It processes intelligence data at a scale that most people cannot comprehend. Now imagine that the co-founder of Palantir is also the largest private landowner, the majority shareholder in critical infrastructure, and a citizen of a Five Eyes intelligence partner. Five Eyes is the intelligence-sharing alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Every intelligence agency in that alliance would immediately flag this as a potential national security threat. Not because Thiel is necessarily dangerous, but because the concentration of economic power, intelligence capability, and citizenship in a single individual within a Five Eyes nation creates a vulnerability that no intelligence framework is designed to handle. New Zealand's Government Communications Security Bureau would have a very bad day. Problem 4. The Maori dimension. Approximately 17% of New Zealand's population is Maori, and Maori rights to land, resources, and governance are enshrined in the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the foundational constitutional document of the country. Maori land trusts control significant territory that is legally inalienable, meaning it cannot be sold, period. Any attempt by an outsider to acquire large-scale assets in New Zealand would inevitably intersect with treaty obligations, iwi interests, and a legal framework that has been contested and negotiated for nearly 200 years. Peter Thiel's lawyers are good, but they are not 200 years of constitutional law good. So, could Peter Thiel buy New Zealand? On paper, his $28 billion could buy roughly 1.2% of all household wealth, 36% of 1 year's government budget, 8 years of the military, or a controlling stake in a third of the public stock market. The numbers are alarming enough to make the premise feel plausible, but practically New Zealand is not a startup. You cannot acquire it with a term sheet and a board seat. It is a sovereign nation with 5.3 million citizens, a functioning democracy, constitutional treaty obligations, foreign investment restrictions, and the full backing of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. The deepest irony is that Peter Thiel already has what he actually wants. He has citizenship. He has land. He has a view of the Southern Alps. He has a bolt hole at the end of the world in case civilization collapses. He does not need to own New Zealand. He just needs the option to show up when everyone else cannot. And that is the real Peter Thiel move. He did not buy the whole country. He bought the exit. The most important real estate in the apocalypse is not a nation. It is a door. And Peter Thiel already has the key. I'm David, and welcome to E.T.E. Thanks for watching.